They settled into the clubhouse and began to reminisce about all the late nights, all the games played on queasy stomachs, all the bus at curfews and splitting headaches. They remembered the games won in dramatic style, 5 o'clock lightning, they'd called it, and one in particular in which an extra-inning home run by the Babe prompted a giddy rush for the train station. They remembered the barbecued ribs and beer. They remembered nervous little Miller Huggins pacing in the dugout during the 4th game of the 1927 World Series, the only man on the planet, it seemed, who doubted the Yankees would win. The mood was ebullient, like a high school reunion at which every old classmate is confident, rich, and handsome. Gehrig, overwhelmed with emotion, left the men for about 30 minutes, retiring to the privacy of Joe McCarthy's office. When he returned, he apologized to his old teammates for not having thought to order a keg of beer. Then everyone cleared out of the clubhouse. The young Yankees took the field, the old Yankees took their seats in the stands, and Gehrig assumed his position on the bench next to McCarthy. There wasn't much action in the game. Even the men on the field seemed bored, or distracted. As he watched the innings roll, Gehrig begged McCarthy for a reprieve from the fast-approaching ceremony. "I'd give a month's pay to get out of this," he said. McCarthy didn't answer. When the game finally ended, with the Yanks losing 3-2, preparations got underway. A brass band marched across the field, drums rattling and horns blaring. The modern Yankees lined up on the third base side of the dirt path between home plate and the pitcher's mound. The Senators stood facing them on the first base side. The 1927 Yankees and the rest of the visiting dignitaries, including Mayor LaGuardia and U.S. Postmaster General James Farley, stood near home plate. LaGuardia wore a cream-colored double-breasted suit. Babe Ruth, having arrived in plenty of time for the ceremony, also wore a cream-colored suit, though his was twice as big and a lot flashier than the mayor's. Several microphones were perched on tripods atop home plate, marking the spot reserved for the guest of honor. Gehrig stepped gingerly from the dugout. Barrow, wearing a straw hat and big sunglasses, gripped Gehrig's left arm with both hands, as though pushing him and holding him up at the same time. The two men walked toward home plate. When they drew near, Barrow released his grip, letting Gehrig complete the journey alone. He had about 10 yards to go. He lowered his head, avoiding all eye contact. He walked slowly and awkwardly. His pants were pulled up high around his waist. His shirt, far too big now for his chest, fluttered slightly in the breeze. The fans stood and cheered. Gehrig never acknowledged them. He stopped when he reached home plate and took a position opposite the grove of microphones that marked center stage. If he had looked up, he might have seen his wife and parents. He might have seen the uncomfortable looks in the eyes of some of his teammates. He might have seen the fans standing against the screen behind home plate, their fingers wrapped tightly in the netting that protects spectators from foul balls. But he didn't look up. He hung his head and began to cry as Sid Mercer, the master of ceremonies, introduced the first speaker. LaGuardia stepped to the microphone, put his hands on his hips, and called Gehrig the perfect prototype of the best to be found in sportsmanship and citizenship. Postmaster General James Farley said the guest of honor would live long in baseball. Then came McCarthy, Gehrig's manager and friend, who sobbed as he spoke into the microphone. "Lou, what else can I say except that it was a sad day in the life of everybody who knew you when you came to my hotel room that day in Detroit and told me you were quitting as a ball player because you felt yourself a hindrance to the team. My God, man, you were never that. Ruth took a turn. Though their relationship had been troubled, and though the babe could be foolish and crude, he never held a grudge. Now, he seemed genuinely happy to be reunited with his old pal. In 1927, he said, Lou was with us, and I say that it was the greatest ball club the Yankees ever had. He rattled on for a minute or so, encouraging Gehrig to catch a lot of fish in his free time. The gifts piled up at his feet. He accepted a fishing rod and tackle from his teammates, a framed parchment with the words "Don't Quit" across the top from the Senators, another parchment from the Old Timers Association of Denver, a ring from the Jewelers Ditches in the Clust, a fruit bowl and 2 silver candlesticks from members of the New York Giants, a silver pitcher from the Harry M. Stevens firm, which employed the young men in white jackets who sold concessions at the stadium, 2 platters from the Stevens employees, a smoking stand from the newspaper writers who covered the team, a silver cup from the Yankees office staff, and a silver serving set from the team's management. When McCarthy presented a trophy with an eagle perched atop a baseball, Gehrig bent over immediately to set it down in the grass, as if the weight were too much for him. Throughout the ceremony, Gehrig looked as if he couldn't wait to get it over with. He twisted his baseball cap in his hands. He pawed at the dirt with his cleats. He removed a big white handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped his tears. He shifted his weight from left to right and stared at the ground. McCarthy, afraid that Gehrig might collapse, asked Babe Dahlgren to be prepared to step in and make the catch. When all the speeches and presentations and introductions were through, Mercer stood quietly in front of the microphone for a moment and waited to see if Gehrig would address the audience. Another big blast of noise came from the crowd. "We want Lou." The people chanted. "We want Lou." Gehrig had given some thought to what he might say. Eleanor, in her memoirs, would say that Gehrig had written an outline of his remarks but hadn't rehearsed. Now, overwhelmed by emotion, he didn't think he could go through with it. He shook his head. No. The master of ceremonies leaned into the microphone and told the crowd that he was sorry, but Gehrig was too moved to speak. In the grandstand, his mother and father both sobbed. Eleanor's eyes were dry, but her body trembled. "We want Lou," the crowd bellowed. Gehrig turned toward the dugout. Workers stepped toward home plate, getting ready to haul away the cables that snaked through the grass and led to the microphones at home plate. Suddenly, Joe McCarthy moved to Gehrig's side, put a hand on his back, and spoke softly in his ear, encouraging him to speak. Gehrig nodded and moved slowly toward the microphones. He had never been able to disobey orders. He lowered his head and ran his right hand through his hair. There was one more wave of noise from the crowd and then dead silence. Every man and woman, every peanut vendor and usher, every ball player and bat boy, every photographer and writer seemed to stare and wait. Even the men in the press box stopped typing. Gehrig swallowed hard. He wiped his eyes again. The wind blew softly from right field to left, snapping the flags above the grandstand. Over 60,000 people, and there was not a murmur, not a sound, recalled Jim Walls at Fort Thomas, Kentucky, who watched from a seat in the grandstand on the third base side. I felt thrills up and down my spine. Minutes seemed to pass. At last, Gehrig bent over slightly in the direction of the microphones, took a deep breath, and began to speak. "For the past 2 weeks, you've been reading about a bad break," he said, his voice cracking so that the last word of the sentence came out dry. He stopped, dropped his head again, and swallowed. Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth." He paused as his voice echoed through the ballpark, but he didn't look up. The sorrowful expression on his face never changed. "I have been in ballparks for 17 years and have never received anything but kindness and encouragement from you fans," he said. "When you look around, wouldn't you consider it a privilege to associate yourself with such fine-looking men as are standing in uniform in the ballpark today? Sure, I'm lucky. Who wouldn't consider it an honor to have known Jacob Ruppert? Also, the builder of baseball's greatest empire, Ed Barrow? To have spent 6 years with such a grand little fellow as Miller Huggins? To have spent the next 9 years with that smart student of psychology, the best manager in baseball today, Joe McCarthy? Who wouldn't feel honored to room with such a grand guy as Bill Dickey? When the New York Giants, a team you would give your right arm to beat, and vice versa, sent you a gift, that's something. When the groundskeepers and office staff and writers and old-timers and players and concessionaires all remember you with trophies, that's something. When you have a wonderful mother-in-law who takes sides with you and squabbles against her own daughter, that's something. When you have a father and mother who work all their lives so that you can have an education and build your body, it's a blessing. When you have a wife who has been a tower of strength and shown more courage than you dreamed existed, that's the finest I know." He swallowed hard. "So I close in saying that I might have had a bad break, but I have an awful lot to live for. Thank you." Even as the final words tumbled out of his mouth and reverberated through the grandstand, he began to back away from the microphone. The band began to play a German folk song, "Du liegst mir im Herzen, you are always in my heart." Babe Ruth moved in, reached for a handshake, and then grabbed Gehrig in a hug. The photographers went crazy. Gehrig managed a small, crooked smile. Cheers rolled over the ballpark and continued until Gehrig disappeared into the dugout. Excerpt from Luckiest Man. Jonathan I. Used by permission.